Well, thank you, Dennis. I regard myself as a warm-up act for Michael Kirby. Jim asked me if I would participate in the launch, and then the book arrived sometime later, and I've been reading more or less ever since. Worlds in Transition is a large, rich and challenging book. About 16 years ago, Jim and Joe published The End of Sovereignty, The Politics of a Shrinking and Fragmenting World, which was a prescient analysis of the changes that are too often subsumed under the term globalisation, in which they had particular interest in the implications for systems of government and understandings of government that were brought under strain by the shrinkage and fragmentation that they explored. Now, this present account is called Worlds in Transition, a title that caused me an involuntary shudder. Mind you, I'm not convinced that the word governance in the subtitle adds anything to the older and perfectly adequate one, government, which has always encompassed non-state institutions, but no doubt I'll have that explained to me. But Worlds in Transition did trouble me because more than 30 years ago, as a very young academic, I was working at Murdoch University, then in its infancy, and a hothouse of the counterculture in its most millenarian form. And just as sparrows failed to make the trip across the Nullarbor, so the ideas of people like R.D. Laing and Carlos Castaneda and Charles Wright and various other prophets had been kept carefully out of Western Australia under the regime of Charles Court, for whom mineral development and economic growth were a secular religion. Murdoch University, with an orgone box in the corner of the common room of its School of Social Inquiry, was a magnet for every form of dissent, and World in Transition was the name of a large foundation course that proclaimed the new post-materialist, post-realist and indeed post-rationalist ethos. And I was called on to teach this subject. Now, I found it shallow and sloppy and often solipsistic, but then I should add that the Professor of Peace and Conflict Studies who helped devise it, a mesmeric caftan-wearing American with a shark's tooth in his ear, described me as an anal Stalinist. Now, Joe and Jim's use of the term Worlds in Transition, I think, is a much more serious quality. I only wish that an earlier version of the book had been available back at Murdoch University in the 1970s. The book is remarkably rich in its range and rigorous in its argumentation. The point of departure is signalled in the book's subtitle, Evolving Governance Across a Stressed Planet. Many of the challenges that they identified in their earlier work have clearly intensified, especially the shrinkage of the world through new forms of information technology, the fragmentation of international institutions that were created after the Second World War, and the urgency of the problems that confront us. And in a series of quite substantial chapters, they consider those problems. They lay emphasis on the economy, the environment, the internet and its uses, public health, military conflict, and much else. And all of these problems impinge on questions of power, the mechanisms and forms of decision-making, and perhaps of greatest concern to them, on the legitimation of authority with traditional doctrines of state sovereignty. And out of that comes their subtitle, Evolving Governance Across a Stressed Planet. And there's much to admire in each dimension of stress that they discuss. And in the time available to me, I just want to select a couple of them. I was delighted to see that their treatment has a very rich temporal dimension. That is, they begin no later than the emergence of Homo sapiens. And they trace a process of human evolution that lays particular emphasis on the human species' capacity for reflexivity. They distinguish and characterise the earlier epochs that help them define the modern epoch and its limits. They embed their evaluations in the idea of modernity as a historically contingent order. Its points of stress not arising suddenly as a result of unfortunate consequences, but as a part of a complex process of interaction that they describe to us. If I were, I suppose, to venture any reservations on the long history, it would probably be that it relies very heavily on physical anthropology, but there are probably some physical anthropologists present. And it's true to say that the contemporary form of world history, often called big history now, uses the same disciplinary emphasis in which the cognitive capacity of the human species forms the master narrative. And the category of culture, which is central, I think, to the argument, subsumes the philosophical and ethical dimensions with which I'm more familiar and with which I have some sort of attachment. I admired particularly the way in which, in treating each one of their big themes, they provide an explicit theoretical and methodological framework. Theirs is not an alarmist account, although it presents much from which we should be alarmed, and it resists the temptation to present data in the form of linear trends that must be reversed. And they recognise throughout the contested nature of the problems that they're discussing and interpreting. Just one example. In the chapter on the economy, they make extensive use of Karl Polanyi. Some of you, I hope, will be familiar with his book, The Great Transformation, an extraordinary book, written in 1940, about the consequences of the market society against a background of fascism and war. And Polanyi, in a very tight argument, shows how the application of the market as a self-regulating system to every corner of society destroys the very basis of social life. He shows that if you treat land and labour and currency as mere commodities, you overlook their intrinsic significance and the importance of nature, humanity and security. And the book therefore emphasises the double movement, that is the colonisation of society by the market society and the social resistance to that colonisation. Another aspect of the book that struck me forcibly, in their discussion of the ecological crisis and the attack on environmental scientists, they take care to remind us of the principles, the foundations of the scientific enterprise. And surely no one here can have ignored the systematic campaign to denigrate environmental science waged by the Murdoch press over the last few months. Late last year, the chief scientist asked the presidents of the 4 learned academies for their views about how these attacks could be rebutted. And I was there in my capacity then as the head of the Academy of Social Sciences, and I had to bite my tongue and resist the impulse to say welcome to the club. Because several years earlier, when the history wars were underway and the Howard government was debauching the Australian Research Council, the scientists saw no reason at all to come to the defence of historians, even though they now experience a very similar type of denigration using exactly the same tactics. But I did at that meeting caution against the response that relies on the exclusive authority of the expert, the trust me, I'm a scientist line, along with its mechanisms of peer assessment, which for many in the public, I think, only feeds mistrust. As Jim and Joe point out, the principles that guided the scientific enterprise in its, what I think I could call its golden age, were codified by the American sociologist Robert Merton as universalism, communality, disinterested and organised scepticism. And they are very difficult principles to sustain now. Disinterestedness and organised scepticism surely are difficult to affirm now that science is so intimately bound into the innovation economy, and environmental science is a vast public enterprise, which commands very large public research funds precisely because it is environmental science. Now this book, I think, avoids that temptation. Trust me, I'm an expert. It doesn't speak ex cathedra. It doesn't invoke a higher authority. It introduces the reader to a rich and compelling inquiry, provides them with the evidence and the argument. I think it's an extraordinarily important book, and I have great pleasure in participating in its launch.